I'm going to move on to her introduction. So I'm very happy to welcome Lauren Robinson as our today's speaker. Lauren did her PhD at Edinburgh University together with Alex Weiss. She then worked as the postdoctoral researcher at Disney's Animal Kingdom, followed by positions at the universities of California, Vienna, and Georgia. At the universities of Vienna and Georgia, she currently holds a joint postdoc position studying cooperation in domestic dogs and wolves. Her postdoc ends in August and she's currently job hunting. So if you know any opportunities, she told me she's very happy to hear about them. Lauren is an animal welfare scientist and psychologist specialized in animal personality and the question how personality traits are associated with animal welfare, happiness, and health. I got to know Lauren from her work as an editor of a book entitled Non-Human Primate Welfare, that she very politely but persistently pushed through the publication process. And I'm very much looking forward to reading this book soon. Until then, I'm very happy to welcome her at Leibniz Science Campus, giving her presentation about primate personality and health, welfare, and happiness. Lauren, it's your stage.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and I am looking forward to sharing the book with you and everyone else after 6 years. So yes, that will be great. So, I realize I used the wrong title on this, but it goes back to what I want to talk as well about is what the caretaker knows, observer ratings of animal welfare. And that's going to be one of the main focuses in this talk. The reason being, when I started my PhD with Alex Weiss, there was a word that always comes up in the animal sciences, anthropomorphism. It's one that I think has been really holding us back in a lot of ways, because of course, while it has value, I think we've leaned too far into it to the point where we're not utilizing valuable information. So what if instead we lean more into critical anthropomorphism? Where we use our empathy and we temper it with objective knowledge of the species, life history, behavior, and physiology. So we use what we know as animals ourselves in combination with rigorous validation methods and what we know about the animals, objective knowledge, to validate these things and test if they are anthropomorphic projections or if they are accurate based on our experiences with the species and as animals ourselves. And so that's where, observer ratings come in. The reason to use them, I know you guys have a background across a lot of different topics, so I'll give you a general introduction to the topic rather than spend too long on defining and telling you how to measure welfare. But basically those traditional methods that we use, observation, physiological measures, cognitive bias tasks are great. But they're really not making use of the expertise and the knowledge of our technicians, our keepers, our fellow researchers, caretakers in general. They can tell you about an animal's welfare pretty well a lot of the time, but we're not quantifying that knowledge. Whereas surveys and ratings of welfare, the nice thing about them is they can be used in addition to traditional methods because they're fast, they're very easy to use, and they're practical. And so they're one more bit of animal welfare information, another way to track it that is quick and easy to use. And so we should never, turn our backs on something like that, right? When the goal is to increase the welfare of animals. And like I said, it utilizes a resource that's already there, that staff knowledge, whether we're quantifying it or not. Every day they're making observations, they're making mental notes about the animal's welfare. So we could use that. It's an additional tool that we can cover multiple aspects of an animal's welfare quickly. If I need to do a physical check, if I need to assess the social relationships, the stress levels using, say, behavior and vet checks, that's going to take a while. Whereas I can ask an observer to tell me what they think of the current health, the current stress, and so on within 5 minutes in a lot of times. And using that information, we can actually use data reduction methods and come up with composite scores of welfare. So instead of a lot of different, information all over, we can come up with one score that we can use, as a measure to track over time. And the nice thing about it as well is it complements methods that we're already using in human well-being. A lot of times in human research, it's surveys. That's the main thing that they're using to look at your own well-being and your own happiness. It's not often that they can get you to come in and give blood draws all the time, right? Or, it's a bit weird to have an observer sitting in your office making notes about your behavior. So it's complementary to the human work. And so I think that opens doors for us to make comparisons and then possibly, talk about funding opportunities that we're not utilizing as much right now. Let's see. All right. So personality and welfare. I like really general definitions. Animal welfare, the psychological and the physiological and the physical health of the animal. Animal personalities. Jones and Gosling argue that this general definition, characteristics of individuals that describe and account for consistent patterns of feeling, thinking, and behaving, covers pretty much anyone that's studying personality and the construct that they're trying to get at. The reason to study them together. Animal personality is an individual difference. Welfare is an individual experience. So they quite naturally go together within differential psychology to understand why some individuals may do better than others. Can your consistent differences in thinking, feeling, and behaving, your personality, explain why you differ in how you're feeling, your welfare, So why study them together, right? Well, ideally, if we can identify the personality domains that are associated with reduced welfare, we can use this information to identify animals that are at risk of having reduced welfare in the long term. And by doing so, we may be able to be proactive by providing these animals with earlier care. And through that as well, perhaps we can understand variations in health and results, thinking about the 3 R's, thinking about replications and things like that. Personality and welfare, may be impacting our studies. And so we need to consider that statistical noise as well. Obviously, we want to improve welfare for the lives of animals, but when we're working with, say, biomedical people who may not have the same interest in welfare as we do, just as farm animal researchers have to think about, improved meat quality and welfare, we need to be thinking about the 3 R's and pointing out that better welfare is better science, right? And so that's the idea that, perhaps by understanding personality and welfare together, we can work towards individualizing care as well as improving our models and ideally result in better welfare and higher quality science by considering these things together. So the aims of what was my PhD research, the first one I wanted to know is really, could observers rate welfare reliably? A lot of times, people would tell me, oh, techs, they work at a lab. They're not going to want to give honest ratings of welfare. But we need to test that before we can reach that conclusion because, as you're about to see, they do give quite variable answers and they do give honest ones. Another thing that came up between Alex and I, and Alex is extremely tolerant as a supervisor and always allowed me to disagree with him and was far more polite in response than I was as a PhD student. But one of the things we disagreed on is Alex said you could have everything you need in your environment, and that means the animal has good welfare, but they could still be unhappy. And for me, coming out of a master's in animal welfare, I said, no, modern animal welfare says animal welfare is an individual experience. If the animal is unhappy, by definition, its welfare is reduced, regardless of what's in the environment. And so in the end, he said, well, okay, go test that, see if it's true. And so I wanted to know if this concept of subjective well-being, which is a measure of happiness and, goal achievement in both people and animals, really related to welfare in animals as well. And then finally, of course, testing if personality is related to their health and welfare. So just to give you a little bit more background on subjective well-being. This was a survey designed by King and Landau, published in 2003. It's comprised of 4 simple questions that you ask staff. You say, how often is the animal happy, from, never to always? So basically it's a 1 to 7 Likert scale from, very little to a great deal. How successful are they at achieving their goals? Satisfaction that the animal receives from social relationships, and how happy would that observer be to spend a week as that animal? So obviously in more fundamental research groups, this is quite an odd question to ask them. But the reality is that after testing this survey across primates and felids, the questions show high reliability. They're related to genetics and they're related to personality in non-human animals. And so that seems to work. People seem to agree on their ratings of subjective well-being. So to study welfare and personality, what I did as a PhD student was I studied 66 brown capuchins at Georgia State University, NIH, and Franklin and Marshall College. And then 31 chimpanzees housed at Edinburgh Zoo and Fundació Mona in Spain. And basically, I had them fill out a series of questionnaires. First, I would have 1 to 5 staff rate each animal on subjective well-being. Then I designed a welfare questionnaire with Matthew Leach, who was one of my secondary PhD supervisors. He's mostly known for the mouse grimace scale, which I think is really great. And I'm going to tell you more about the questionnaire in a moment. And then they also rated personality using what's called the hominoid personality questionnaire. And this is a pretty well-validated questionnaire at this point. It's been used, across a lot of primate species, again, related to genetics, reliable, steady over time, overall. So yes, we just wanted to use a validated survey to start with. And so when designing the animal welfare questionnaire, there's this paper I really like by Frank McMillan on quality of life in animals. And in this, he identifies 5 factors that contribute to animal welfare. Those being social relationships, mental stimulation, health, stress, and control. And so I used this to come up with 12 welfare questions relating to these 5 different, factors. And then also considering the fact that nowadays we look at animal welfare and we recognize that it's not just about, how bad animals' lives are, but also we recognize that it ranges to how great their lives are too, right? Up to a life worth living and so on. And so we have these new scales that you could, pull from quality of life / welfare research to consider when rating animals' welfare. And so an example question was, how satisfied is this individual with its perceived ability to control, change, and/or influence its social situation? And taking into consideration, welfare ranging, you have a scale from extremely dissatisfied to extremely satisfied. And so observers were asked to fill out these 12 questions for each animal. And the first thing that I wanted to do was test if the observers agreed. So they fill out these questionnaires, and then I use interclass correlations in the case of the capuchins to test if they actually did, rate the same. Because basically, if people aren't agreeing on their ratings of whatever you're doing, they're no good. So this is the first step when you're using a survey. Test if there's agreement there. And in the case of capuchins, very much so, 0.72, and that's in line with the work on humans. So if you rate your welfare or your personality and your friends or family rate your personality or welfare, it's going to line up with that kind of agreement level. And of course, with the chimpanzees as well. So in that case, we used G theories. So this was basically where we started to realize, okay, people actually do agree on their ratings of animal welfare. This is a good start if you want to try using a new survey. And just to tell you as well, so thinking about psychometrics, which is how you validate things like intelligence tests, which, okay, I don't validate those because that's kind of a messy field, but personality tests, well-being questionnaires, those things, that is the field where you're looking at, is your survey item useful? Does it actually relate to real life things that you observe? And in the case of chimpanzees, we did find that animals that were rated in higher welfare actually had reduced regurgitation and reingestion behaviors, coprophagy, urophagy, and distance to nearest neighbor. The last one we found to be a little bit odd, but that behavioral data set was kind of interesting in itself. So we think it was more about how that was recorded, but you can find more information on that from the 2017 paper. But that's just to show that, you know, these ratings of welfare are actually related to the behaviors that are being observed. And also the chimpanzees, we found those ratings were reliable over time. We had 2 sets of data. So that's very cool. This is what it looks like when you look at the relationships between the 12 items. So we used a data reduction method. We used principal components analysis. And what we found was, in the case of all the species we're going to talk about today, these welfare and subjective well-being items, they all load onto a single component. And so this means that they very much go together. And so you can see for capuchins, you know, happiness as the animal, the number of relationships, the time the animal is happy, reduced stress, these things all go together. The only exception, so we use a cutoff point of 0.4, is physical health in the chimpanzees. This didn't load or relate to the welfare questions or the subjective well-being questions. But the reason for that is probably because chimpanzees in captivity are so healthy as a rule that there's not a lot of variation. And it's important to realize as well, so going back to what I said about, you know, will observers, technicians, and research facilities, will they give honest answers? Well, if everybody rated welfare at, you know, 5, it's amazing, it's always amazing, you wouldn't actually find a structure. You need variability for something to load onto a component like this. And so this shows that they were willing to actually use the scale and that they're agreeing with one another based on the interclass correlations when they do. And so this is cool. All right. So this is the beginning of Alex thinking, okay, maybe subjective and welfare are the same thing. And then we looked at personality in these species. And so we, you know, ran models, of course. And in this case, you can see that capuchins that are more sociable and more assertive tend to be rated as having higher welfare and happiness. And they're less neurotic as well and more attentive. And then for chimpanzees, more extroverted, less neurotic individuals tend to have better welfare. So now we're starting to see that sociability is clearly pretty important for welfare, and reduced neuroticism as well. And this is very much in line with other research on primates and subjective well-being without the welfare questions. And then also in people, right? We see that relationship between extroversion show up. So for my next study, I went to the California National Primate Research Center. I worked with John Capitanio's group, which was awesome. Especially after, you know, 5 years in Edinburgh, it was very nice to get a tan, or as tan as someone as pale as me gets. So I spent 3 months observing their Rhesus macaques, the ones that they house in groups outside. I did classic behavioral observations, so focal observations of self-injury, grooming, you know, rank behaviors, so supplants and aggression and things like that. But this time we decided to extend the research to include 4 new questions specific to Rhesus macaques. And so things like, how much does rank benefit them, considering in relationships with people, right? Specifically for captive animals, we assume that animals that have better relationships with people tend to have better welfare and weight and things like that. And so when we did this, and we also had from observers that were less familiar with the animals. You know, I know you guys are at a primate facility, so you know that depending on the number of animals you have, you can't always, you know, get everybody to know them. I think California has something like 4,000 or 5,000 animals. And so, you know, if the welfare questionnaire is actually going to be a useful tool for, you know, across facilities, then it needs to be something that people that don't know the animals as well can fill out and still agree with. And so in this case, John's staff were kind enough to spend about, I think, 2.5 hours with each of the 3 groups I was studying, learning individuals and rating their welfare on my, you know, this time 16-item questionnaire. And what we found was that their agreement was lower but we also had fewer raters, and again, they didn't spend much time with them, but even 2.5 hours, observing these Rhesus macaques, when you've got people that know Rhesus macaques, by the way, I also wouldn't suggest that you pull a stranger off the street and say, okay, how much do you understand welfare and how much do you agree? But these are people, these are technicians, these are behaviorists that understand, and have an idea of Rhesus macaque behavior. And it turns out that with that little time, they still find agreement between them. And again, thinking about, is well-being, subjective well-being and welfare the same thing? With Rhesus macaques, even with the new questions, we found a single component structure, everything loaded, with the exception of the effective weight. So it seems that you can be a happy, high welfare Rhesus macaque and overweight. So, that's promising for them. But it's just to show that these things very much go together. And in fact, if you separate them out and you create a component score for subjective well-being and welfare based on, these structures, and when I say a component score, there's a mathematical way of adding and subtracting these things to get that composite score that I talked about earlier. But you can see that they correlate at 0.91, 0.95, 0.91 across the species that I studied. And so this shows that very much welfare and subjective well-being are measuring the same construct in the 3 species I studied. And going back to behavior and validation, right? If you create this survey, you want to see that it's actually related to behaviors. So my independent observations of their behavior, oh, it's not in review now, I lie, that's published. But basically found that, yes, there was a relationship. So animals that received more aggression were rated lower on welfare, and individuals that perform more displacement behaviors, so yawning, scratching, so on, also were rated lower on welfare. So it seems to be that ratings very much do reflect behavior, but we didn't find relationships with other ones, perhaps because they were less common. So we definitely didn't find anything with positive behaviors, but I don't know, for anyone that's trying to look at this positive behavioral side of welfare, it's really challenging because play behavior is rare in some cases, or there are studies that suggest it can be a stress relief in itself. So play may not be the positive indicator we think, but we had 44 animals, so it could also be a sample size thing. We just maybe need to get more Rhesus macaques observed and rated to see more of these relationships. And this is just kind of to show you, I've shown you a lot of tables. I think my thesis had 20 odd tables and 2 figures. But this is an example to show you the relationship between aggression and displacement and those scores on welfare, subjective well-being. And then again, going back to personality, we did find that the Rhesus macaques' welfare and subjective well-being was also related to personality. And so in this case, we ran correlations as well as individual models, and we found that they were correlated, that animals that were rated higher on welfare and subjective well-being were more confident, they were more open, more dominant, not as in hierarchical dominance, but trait dominance. So Rhesus macaques, as you can see, have a 6-dimension or structure personality. And then they were friendlier as well. But interesting, there was no relationship between anxiety in this case. So again, personality and welfare, they're associated across these species. So what you can see across that thesis work is that clearly personality is important to welfare and happiness in different ways, but still sociability shows up quite strong. And, for the other ones, neuroticism as well. And then just to throw in one other thing I did, so I went to Oregon as well. So spent 4 months at Beaverton with Chris Coleman's group, and used the same ethogram. In fact, Oregon was first, and then I used the same ethogram in California. And in that case, I was again doing focal observations, ratings of personality, looking at dominance, this kind, the hierarchical kind, in relation to injury and illness. The reason being, I love vet records. So being able to look at a lifetime injury and illness in relation to, recent personality ratings is very interesting to me. And I love that about research facilities, that you have lifetime records. I just love vet records. They're cool. We did, again, this is just to show you data reduction. So instead of using, all the behaviors separately, as you guys probably are experienced with, this is a problem for your p-values, it inflates it. So instead we come up with these component scores based on structures, testing relationships to reduce the amount of models that we have to run. And what I like about this one is what we found was, while there was no relationship with illness, so the frequency of illness across the animal's lifetime, we did find a relationship with injury. Higher confidence and anxiety in these Rhesus macaques was related to fewer lifetime injuries. And this is when you account for behavior and you account for, the hierarchy. And so this is really cool to me because it suggests that even when you account for these classic measures like behavior and hierarchy, personality ratings may actually still be more predictive and show you the relationship with health. And so they do seem to have quite a lot of value. And again, a figure just to show some, the relationship between confidence and anxiety and the number of injuries in the animals. So just to summarize, and I'll talk to you about a couple more things after this, welfare ratings seem to be reliable and associated with behavior in these species. Subjective well-being and welfare are very much measuring the same construct. Personality plays an important role in the welfare, subjective well-being, and health of non-human primates, which is very much in line what we see with humans. I also looked at it in relationship to infant Rhesus macaques. And so again, in this case, more openness, more assertiveness, less anxiety. And 7-week-old Rhesus macaques was actually found to relate to higher subjective well-being. So this was Elizabeth Simpson, and she kind of asked me to come in and do the statistics for the data they'd had collected for a while. So that was cool. But if you're like, oh my gosh, this is way too enthusiastic, everything seems to work, I have good news for you. It doesn't always. So one of the things that I was working with was someone in Australia, Chris Deskovich. I think she's in New Zealand now. Anyway, we were looking at ratings of sun and moon bear personality, welfare, and subjective well-being at a sanctuary. And in this case, we just found really low agreement, meaning that the tool was not useful. We couldn't do anything more with it. But the study had a low number of observers. So we had 2 people per animal. Really, when you do ratings and survey work, you want as many people as you can get. But of course, as we know, you have to, be reasonable as far as practicality goes. It's possible we had issues with translation too. So we had this pretty long survey, and then we had someone who had to read it to the observers because quite a few of them, didn't read, which is totally fine. But we wonder if maybe the translation was an issue, maybe it was too complex. And they were also working with quite a few animals. So I think it was something like 70 animals total for these sun and moon bears. And, they're not always the easiest to understand. And a lot of them are actually rescues. In fact, I think almost all of them. So they're not your normal group anyway. So that's just to say that it doesn't always work. We are trying to get that published, but of course, null results are hard to get published, but we'll see. We're hopeful. Okay, so just to tell you about my life now, of course, Dana presented a little bit. So I'm job hunting, and I put boo there because if you haven't job hunted during a pandemic, I would highly recommend against it. It's awful. But also I have spent the last 2.5 years testing if wolves and group house dogs at the Wolf Science Center cooperate with humans and conspecifics. And spoiler, for all of my studies, they did not. So that's also going to be fun. I'm going to spend a lot of time publishing null results because they're important and they're all I found. Now, I still consult on primate projects. So, I get asked to do statistics or give suggestions on methods and things like that. So I, do have a paper in revision on Capuchin cooperation with Sarah Brosnan as part of this postdoc. We also found that it didn't work there, but that's okay. We found they love Cheerios, and that's a significant result. Don't use Cheerios. Your animals will cooperate just because they love Cheerios. So that's a good lesson. And then grant writing, like I said, I'm supposed to be doing more of that. And that's just to show you a photo of, like, it seems weird, I just presented to you on primates, but me and dogs, we go way back too. So I'll work with whatever. And where my research is going. Well, I hope that one can't postdoc forever. Permanent sounds pretty nice. So, you know, where do I want to go? I'd really like to pursue research that aims to understand these individual differences in personality and welfare and health in relation to cognitive performance. So obviously I'm finishing a postdoc in cognition, and the reason that I sought this postdoc was because I want to understand these variables together at the different individual level. Let me try that again. So I just want to understand how individual differences in these things relate to one another. I think that we've kind of left that out of cognition in the same way that we're increasingly talking about welfare being important for biomedical results. I think that it may be important for cognition results, right? If you send a child to school starving and they fail a test, is it really because they can't do the test, or is it because they're hungry? And I think of welfare as a hunger, and we haven't really accounted for the potential impact it has on test performance in animals. And then also application questions, right? So personality enrichment. I'd like to know how, you know, personality relates to the different types of enrichment that Bloom-Smith et al. Identify in their 1991 paper. And those are, you know, physical, social, occupational, sensory, and nutritional forms of enrichment. So I want to know if certain personality domains relate to how much they like certain types of enrichment. So these kind of mix of, you know, fundamental and applied questions is where my research is going between these topics. And other than that, I don't know. Hopefully I'll know by September, you know, because my contract ends in August. But that is just to show you all the wonderful people that I have been lucky to work with during my PhD, which I finished 4 years ago now, and it is all published as of this year. As of January, all of the papers are out. The last one on those observer ratings of Rhesus macaques came out in AABS early this year. So very pleased to have that fully published. The primate welfare book is submitted and it's all in Springer's hands now. 5 to 6 months, you should be able to hold that. So this work is done for now. So with that, I will say thank you for your time. I will end my sharing and I'll take your questions.